Modern-day Miami and South Florida are home to millions of Cubans and Cuban Americans. Their members and culture have become fully integrated with that of native South Floridians. Nevertheless, Cubans only began migrating to the US in the 1960s. Their unusually fast integration was due to a set of circumstances that sets them apart from other Latino groups. To understand these factors, we need to examine the factors that forced Cubans to emigrate to the US. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his communist regime took over the Cuban government after a successful coup. With political and economic strife sure to follow, many professionals and skilled workers began to emigrate to the US. There were four distinct waves of migration, but the first two were constituted majoritarily of skilled workers and professionals. Over 200,000 arrived between 1959 and 1962 during the first wave, and tens of thousands more by 1973. In the next 2 decades, however, the flow of immigrants was made up of unskilled colored workers. Many began arriving by small boats and rafts, desperate to enter the US with the aid of the wet foot, dry foot policy. Although immigration was somewhat intermittent, between 1959 and 1980 over 800,000 people came to the US. This allowed the Cuban population in Miami to remain remarkably connected with their home country, thus helping maintain their culture strong and healthy. Some Cubans, with the help of the US government, settled in other cities. This, however, wouldn't have a long-standing impact, as most would eventually move to Miami. In 1993, President Clinton decided to end the wet foot, dry foot policy due to an increasing amount of sea migrants. Nevertheless, by this point, the Cuban community was firmly established in Miami and had become surprisingly affluent. To understand the reasons as to why the Cubans were surprisingly prosperous, we will examine two key reasons behind it. The first main reason as to why Cubans were able to establish themselves economically was through the first and second waves. These professionals, despite having little money, managed to provide Miami with valuable skills in high-end professions. These Cubans were quick to acquire not only wealth but the support of the native population. Many immigrants were able to move quickly through the ranks of their respective industries, such as Carlos Arboleda, a clerk who after 8 years owned his own bank. These first immigrants paved the way for the next two waves, which were made up of lower skilled workers. They set up loan systems and help centers for newly arrived Cubans, thus helping them get established quickly. The second major factor in Cuban success was the role and aid of the American government. Unlike any other Latin American nationality, Cubans were openly welcomed in the US. In the fight against communism, the Cold War era presidents granted all Cuban migrants exile status if they could reach the US soil. Moreover, the American government provided over $1.4 billion in resettlement aid to Cubans and set up Cuban refugee programs. This, plus the overall sentiment of the American public towards the victims of communism, helped the Cuban transition. Now that we know why the Cuban people have succeeded as immigrants in the US, we will examine why it is important to represent this issue. As we have learned, Cubans represent an entirely different status of cultural integration in comparison to other Latino groups. To clump them together with Mexican Americans and assume that they have similar cultural integration is inaccurate. Cubans have ranked as the Latin American immigrant group with the lowest instance of material inequality in comparison to whites. Cuban success can serve as an example on how the American people and government can aid Latin American immigrant groups. Lastly, it is vital to learn about the less well-known immigrant groups that have had an important impact in the American society. By doing this, the American public can become more aware of the rich cultural mix that this country can be.